This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, true seekers and true crime junkies. This is Nanette Bartow back with another episode of Hit the Road Jack, Finding the Zodiac. Today we're going to catch back up with a few last murders involved with the JFK. I also have a surprise visit with Nolan Del Campo from last week, who's going to be joining me today in this presentation for what will be some up-and-coming murders that are related to JFK. Let's bring Nolan in now at this point. Good morning, Nolan.
Good morning, Nanette.
Okay, so you made me realize that not only did we have an anniversary last week, which was the anniversary speech of JFK to the American University, one of the greatest speeches ever. You also indicated today we have another anniversary of some political happenings. So what was that?
It's the anniversary of the Watergate break-in.
Oh, and we are going to definitely be coming up on that.
I think it's the 50th anniversary.
50th?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I know that in some of my discussions with Harriet, she has started to discover or what she believes in some of the solves in the Zodiac stuff to have revolved around Nixon, and that possibly Nixon was somebody that he was working with, which I thought was rather interesting because we do see him calling out politicians in the Atlanta, Georgia child murders, which are going to come at about the same time the Watergate scandal breaks. So I'm not really sure what Watergate was about. Can you share some of that with us?
Yes. In 1972, Nixon was going to be running for re-election, and the election was in November, and they formed what was called CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. And it was headed by John Mitchell, who was then the Attorney General for Nixon. And basically, they had a slush fund of money they raised from private donors and crooks and mafia and a lot of their political friends. And with some of that money, they hired what they called the plumbers, which are basically CIA operatives, FBI operatives, and gangsters and other people to do various things. They called it rat fucking. And what they would do, they would break into places, they would steal things. And as one of their things they did was the Democratic National Headquarters was at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And some of the plumbers, involving E. Howard Hunt, who we mentioned last week, Frank Sturgis, G. Gordon Liddy, and others broke into the Watergate Hotel. And as they were leaving, they set off an alarm, and a few of them got caught. And so that led to the Watergate scandal.
Okay, so
basically they were trying to influence the presidential election, kind of a pattern we see in American politics lately.
So some of the things we talked about last week was like Hoffa giving $500,000 worth of the Teamsters money to Nixon to help him get elected. Was that part of that?
That was separate.
Okay.
That was in the 1960 election when he was running against JFK.
Oh, that's right. So then I'm
sorry to interrupt. Hoffa still maintained his hatred for both Kennedys till the day he died.
Correct. So 1972, you said, is when the Watergate break-in occurred?
Yes.
And then, so I believe that the Atlanta, Georgia child murders, they come on the heels of the actual investigation of the Watergate. So I don't know if the Warren Commission was convening at that point, but there was an active investigation and some type of a committee convening in Atlanta during the Atlanta, Georgia child murders.
Yes. There was also one in Washington, D.C. It was, I forget, the special House investigation into the Watergate break-in. And that went on for at least a year. It was must-see TV for about a year. And Sam Ervin was the House, I think he was the Speaker of the House. Anyway, he was in charge of the committee's investigation. And you had people like Ehrlichman and John Dean and Haldeman and all those guys testify, Liddy.
And do you know what year that was?
That was probably 73 to 74, up until Nixon resigned, early 74.
Gotcha. Okay. So that miss the mark.
It was post-election, for sure.
Gotcha.
Of course, in November he won the election over McGovern by a landslide. And then he was sworn in again. And of course, he was a sitting president, but sworn in again in January. And then after January, probably a couple months, that's when the investigation started. There was an investigation by the Washington Post first, by Woodward and Bernstein, under the direction of Ben Bradley, who came up last week. And I think he's going to come up this week in our discussion of Mary Meyer. But I'm getting ahead of myself there.
No, yeah.
The editor of the Washington Post.
We're going to actually jump into that here shortly. So what was it that they were looking to steal in Watergate?
Anything that could help them to help Nixon get reelected, and anything they could use for dirt against the Democrats. Just whatever. They were on a fishing expedition.
So Nixon
was the national headquarters, so there was a lot to peruse.
So Nixon was a Republican then?
Yes.
And what was JFK? Democrat. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know that with the 8,000 votes that were forged in Illinois for JFK to become president, we were told that Mayor Daley, I believe, was he ended up being a senator, but he wasn't actually on the ballot and wasn't actually voted in. He literally was made a senator without even being voted for, because his name never even actually ended up on the ballot for voting. And he made it into a Republican spot, but the second that he took the spot, he flipped back over to the Democrat that he was. So I was just trying to put into relation. And I've seen this happen in a couple cases, especially with Hillary Clinton. She used to be a Republican, but everybody now knows her today as a Democrat. And what most people don't know is that she, I believe, was an acting attorney on the Watergate scandal. And at that time had been a Republican and then flipped to Democrat at some point in time. I don't know what made her change her decision, but she was literally listed as a Republican previous to the Watergate scandal.
Yeah, I don't know about that history of Hillary, but I know Daley, whatever you call him, Republican, Democrat, he's always been a fascist.
Yeah. So basically, let's jump back into the presentation at this point. Some of the things that Harriet was finding in her solves were the connections to the mob. One of them was to what they referred to as the Irishman. And of course, I had indicated a couple weeks ago, I had actually watched this movie a few times just to kind of collect what I could to be some of the loose truth that story was based on. It was a true book, obviously, supposedly written by Frank Sheeran. And he was handled by Russell Buffalino and befriended Hoffa. Now, I've been told that he befriended Hoffa, but more or less to get information on Hoffa, not to necessarily be one of his hitmen or his goons. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with that part of the history of the mob and Hoffa.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I am aware that Vito Genovese basically moved to become the head Don, and he did it through violent measures.
Correct. So that's what we started with here today. Was Russell Buffalino was Joe Pesci in the movie The Irishman. And I did bring up here, you can see down in this smaller box, as I had indicated, we know that this man was responsible for a lot of murders. However, you'll see that the only thing that he was actually convicted of was extortion and conspiracy. And that's why I find it interesting that the Zodiac case in itself had been listed as extortion rather than a serial killing. And I don't know if that that was an attempt for the FBI to be able to drop the case so that they didn't have to be involved, because crossing jurisdictions and murdering people in different locations definitely requires FBI involvement, at least as far as I know. So basically,
Well,
go ahead.
at that point, J. Edgar Hoover, who of course had run the FBI for a number of years and continued to run the FBI until his death in the early 70s, he maintained there was no such thing as a Cosa Nostra at that time.
Oh, well,
and
we're
even
about
into the middle of the Nixon administration, basically.
Well, of course. So we don't find anything out until 30, 40 years after the fact, right?
Yeah.
So this information is mostly taken from Wikipedia, and basically it talks about Russell Buffalino, who basically he was the go-between between many of the mobsters to either keep the peace or to approve a hit. It states that he was deported several times, but the Italian government would not even readmit him to the country because of his criminal activities. And in 1957, after taking control of the Luciano crime family from boss Frank Costello, boss Vito Genovese wanted to legitimize his new power by holding a national Cosa Nostra meeting. And that's what you were just talking about, correct?
Yes.
It says basically just to make it known that he had become the new mafia don, or the most powerful mafioso in the United States. And Italy convened at Barbara's estate. Is it Barbara or Barbera?
I think it's Barbera.
Barbera's estate in Appalachian, New York. Cuba was one of the Appalachian topics of discussion, particularly gambling and narcotics smuggling interest of the La Cosa Nostra on the island. The international narcotics trade was also an important topic on the agenda. Now, this is why I see that they needed all of these aviators and pilots, right? I mean, how else are they getting these drugs in?
One of the reasons, yes. And also, I think a lot of it, too, was to convince everyone to work together and to make it a more well-oiled machine so they could all make more money. And also, a lot of them up to that point were kind of anti-drugs. They liked making their money the older traditional mafia ways, but they realized at that point that the biggest money that besides the gambling was going to be the drugs. And so that's one of the sticking points of that meeting. And then, of course, we all know what happened at that meeting got raided.
Yes,
but I don't think it was the FBI that raided it. I think it was, what's that?
I think it talks about it in here as we go in. Okay. One of the most noted things is that a lot of people have always believed that the CIA has been responsible for bringing drugs and guns into inner cities, supplying the United States Americans with it. But what everybody has to realize is that there was always a way for these individuals to get past customs, to get this stuff through, which means they had to have somebody on the other side or inside of the United States making it possible for them to achieve these type of crimes, basically.
Right. And the CIA is known to have their own airports in desolate parts of the country, in Texas and other areas.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And we see a lot of them. In fact, we're going to be coming up to a missing pilot who is actually from Texas, who has direct links or ties to David Ferry and some of this stuff. It says the New York garment industry interest in rackets such as loan sharking to the business owners and control of garment center trucking were other important topics on the Appalachian agenda. So my knowledge or my thought process of what I've learned over the years in regards to the mob was that they legitimized many of their activities into legitimate businesses while still running their crime sprees through those businesses, including money laundering and such, loan sharking, or even what I would call paid security. So they would force their business owners to pay them out of pocket for what they called protection. And of course, we see that in the long run, CIA agents, once they're done with the CIA, actually become that paid protection or that security, correct?
Yes, both the mob and the CIA are known for putting up front organizations to legitimize the things that are going on behind the scenes. So that way they could launder the money. It's like, for instance, the waste management field. The mob controlled that field for a number of years and probably still does today.
Right, right. Well, every time I think of contract security, that's exactly what I think of, is not these security guards you see without guns standing around Walmart or Kmart or the mall, but the individuals that are actually actively protecting high corporate officials and politicians and things of that nature.
Howard Hughes had a guy named Robert Mayhew who was in charge of his security. And Mayhew had all these connections with the CIA and with Roy Cohen, who was the lawyer for McCarthy. And Mayhew basically had connections with the mob, the CIA, and all kinds of different organizations. But also he had a quasi-legitimate security company that hired out to various entities that you just talked about.
Correct.
Private entities.
So our next, go ahead.
Go ahead. And some actual politicians as well.
Correct. The slide we're looking at now is actually Frank Sheeran, who The Irishman is actually, the movie The Irishman is actually made after. I don't know when his book came out, whether it was pre his death or after his death, but he admits to many murders. So why he was never arrested for them, I don't know. Likely because the book might have come out after he passed, as many people have probably chosen to have happen, since they don't want to be arrested and go to jail at the late ages that they are. In fact, Jack indicated to Dennis Kaufman that he was okay with him writing a book about him being a Zodiac, but he did not want that to be done before he passed away, because he was afraid of what others would think or know about him previous to him dying. So the Irishman admits to many murders, but is never apprehended. He's arrested or convicted and is not, arrested or convicted of any of them. He also heads the Teamsters 107 union. And in fact, the mobsters seem to fall under extortion, just like I said. So if we look here at the convictions that Frank Sheeran went under, he had labor racketeering basically listed as his conviction. So why is it that they seem to find it easy to convict them on these charges, Nolan, rather than on charges of murder, when they know that they were directly responsible for these murders?
I don't have a precise answer for you there. I think one reason a lot of the racketeering convictions occurred is because of the RICO statutes, which was federal statutes that gave more leeway for federal investigators and federal prosecutors to go after people for conspiracy, and racketeering is essentially another word for conspiracy. And but it's in the area of business and in labor organization and things like that.
Gotcha. Now, I noticed also while I was going through this that it appeared as though many of these mobsters actually received pardons from their sentences as well.
Yeah, they had a lot of friends in high places.
Wouldn't we all like? So as we carry on, we see some of the connections between Stefano Magaddino and Russell Buffalino on our way down to some of the things that I mentioned in the keywords area of the Zodiac killer, and some of his communications was the underworld came up a lot. Now, sometimes he was referring to that when he was talking about bodies that were found that were underground. But underworld seemed to be something that he kept talking about. And the only thing I could really associate underworld to, obviously, is Black Ops, CIA. Now people know it as the dark web, like anything that is not available to the average public.
Yeah, because a lot of the times when the CIA or even the FBI, other organizations like that, military intelligence, it wasn't the actual people that were in the entities at the time. It would have been like people affiliated, assets as they call them, or people that had been sacked or fired or allegedly retired that were basically still running these operations. That way it gave the organizations like CIA, FBI, military intelligence, things like that, or even LAPD, New York PD, Chicago PD, entities like that. It gave them plausible deniability.
Of course, if they don't.
It wasn't us officially, but it was their assets or former members of their organizations or former leaders of their organizations that were some of the main plotters and some of the main executioners.
Gotcha. Well, I know that the Zodiac also referred to what was called the perverted underground or underworld, which I haven't really climbed into the perverted part of it and knowing what he means exactly in regards to perverted. Many people have kind of leaned towards child pedophilia, child trafficking, human trafficking. This may be what Jack found to be perverted. I know that there are children that have been killed throughout these series, but I don't think that that was something Jack was completely down for, was not something he wanted to do. In fact, we see him requesting that forced killing stop during one of the child killing sprees. So I want to tend to believe that perverted might be just that.
I think that could be part of it, but I think it also refers to these unholy alliances that were taking place between, say, the mob and the government. And so, and between former Nazis like Oscar Scorzeni, who was based out of Madrid under the Franco regime, which is a fascist regime, and alliances between Nazis and Alan Dulles and the CIA. And so those are some of the perverted relationships that I think he might have been referring to as well as what you said, the uglier, or just as ugly, but in a different way in regard to trafficking and things like that.
Correct. So our next one here, we just slipped on over into Joseph Bonanno. Of course, it does flip-flop back and forth between the Magadinos and Bonventuri. I did highlight some of the areas as we finished off with Magadino. It does, again, look like he operated a legitimate funeral home business. Now, that's kind of ironic, I thought. You can handle the people that you're killing in the end and still make some money off of it. But it says Magadino really made his money running profitable bootlegging business. And so, again, this ties back into Jack. He began as a bootlegger, and I think this is where he got his feet wet with these individuals. He operated also by smuggling wine and spirits across Niagara River into New York State. It says after the prohibition ended, Magadino and his crime family made their money by means of loan sharking, illegal gambling, extortion. Now we see the extortion come up again, carjacking and labor racketeering, as well as other legitimate lucrative businesses such as linen services. And we talked about this because when I think Jack is ordered out of the Bay Area to go find a new life, he finds himself back into another world where the mob exists, which is Tahoe, and he begins working for the Tahoe Linen Service. We do have a series of murders in which case folded uniforms were found leading up to the victim. So literally he stacked folded uniforms like dropping bird crumbs right up to the victim. And I believe that also occurred around the time that Jack was actually running the linen truck service. They also, it looks like, okay, so they actually served legitimate lucrative businesses such as the linen service business that served the needs of most hotels located throughout the region, as well as taxi cab companies and other service-oriented businesses. So now we have the taxi cab tie-in. Okay. We also see that there is movement with Magadino's family into Canada from Fort Erie, opposite Buffalo, to Toronto, Ontario, and as far east as Montreal, Quebec. So now we see again a tie-in with these individuals into Canada, and we know that Jack talks about Canada in some of his, in fact, we have letters mailed out of Canada in some of these crime sprees. So the crime syndicate supplied drugs to the Canadian cities of Hamilton and Guelph, which in turn supplied drugs to Toronto. I think that most people need to understand that the mob is still completely and very active today. I pulled an excerpt in regards to a Ralph Natal. Do you know who that is, Nolan?
I do not.
Okay. He's one of your newer mobsters. It says that he was an American mobster. He was the boss of the Philadelphia crime family. And we know that we have letters from the Zodiac written to Philadelphia from 1995 until 1999, when he became the first American mafia boss to turn state's evidence. Natal helped sentence Joey Merlino to a 14-year sentence in 2001, but in January of 2005 was also sentenced for racketeering himself, receiving a 13-year sentence. So I just want people to understand understand that this man was still operating as a mob boss in January of 2005. So when everybody looks at this like the mob is a long sordid past that we had as an American nation but doesn't exist anymore is completely not true. I think not too long ago, actually, maybe even a few years ago, we heard that there was a shooting at one of the mob boss's houses, correct? They thought it was like his daughter's son, I believe, was trying to get back at him. I don't remember which crime boss this was, but they talked heavily about it in the news not too long ago.
I missed that one too. What's happened with the mob is they've made so much money and gained so much political influence and power that a lot of their businesses are quasi legit now, and a lot of the sons and daughters and grandchildren have gone on to get college educations and get good jobs and become lawyers and politicians, and so they basically become functioning part of legitimate society while still doing the stuff behind the scenes to make, with the drugs and other illicit activities. But they have so many legitimate activities that and so much power that it's even more difficult to figure out who the real mobsters are and to distinguish them from just kind of shady politicians or shady business people that exist out there outside the mob.
And the first one that comes to mind that I think of is like Rockefeller, right? Part of the mob at some point.
That family's been shady for a long time. And
of course,
if you want to go back to it, the Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, had mob connections and made a lot of money doing illicit things with alcohol running during Prohibition and whatnot. So, but later, there's a lot of different people, entities, and families that are mob connected.
Well, and it always kind of dawned on me. I mean, when you think about Rockefeller Center in New York, one of the most expensive states in our nation, has named an entire square or center after an individual who was known to have been affiliated with illegal money. And is that what we do? Do we honestly, memorialize or remember people by throwing up huge squares in the middle of rich towns in order to memorialize somebody who wasn't really on the up and up?
Well, when you think about it, most of the industrialists from the turn of the century through World War I and that era up until World War II, from the post Civil War through World War II, a lot of those were cutthroat fascist people, strike breakers. They would hire henchmen to shoot people down, kill strike breakers. So they were doing the same things the mob has been doing for years, same tactics, but they called themselves legitimate businessmen, and the cops were on their side. They bought the politicians, so the same crooked shit's been going on for forever and ever. And now it's just not so upfront, not so blatant,
right? Unless you're looking for it.
It's out there to find. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, so basically I stated that if we thought the mob is no longer concerned, we see that it is still going strong. They're just better at hiding their deeds. And instead of assassination, they character assassinate. I think they realized after the group of individuals assassinated in the JFK round that brought too much attention. It was too hard to cover up. Evidence and forensics was getting stronger, and it wasn't something that they could hide as easy as they did back in the day by walking up and shooting somebody on the street. The reason for the information during this time in my presentation is the relation of Jack having info on the JFK murder, and that his life steadily follows many of the paths of the mob and the CIA individuals. Plus, the Zodiac killer talked heavily about underground perverted systems, syndicates, politicians, and the need for the forced killing to stop. And that's really what led me on this path of the mob. And then, of course, we have Harriet, who is, putting together what she believes is solves that's indicating that he has a direct relation, or that his handlers quite possibly are the CIA and the mob. The Zodiac killer also bragged for most of his communications that he was smarter than law enforcement and the FBI. And this kind of crossed me like there was some type of a pissing contest between the FBI and the CIA. And my research has actually revealed that, correct?
Yes. That's another weird duo they cooperated on a lot of things. For instance, CIA was heavily involved in the assassination of JFK, and I believe RFK. But the FBI looked the other way. They were in charge of the investigations of those two assassinations, and they didn't, they did a terrible job. But that doesn't mean they liked each other. But it was a convenient alliance because it benefited both of them. But there are several different issues on which they saw things differently and were kind of competitors or just didn't like what the other entity was doing and were in kind of competition, yes.
And didn't you say that there was supposed to be some type of investigation that was to occur with JFK, and for whatever reason it was put on hold, you said, or didn't actually follow through? They didn't do what they needed to do to properly investigate that case?
Oh, well, two things that happened. Allen Dulles was appointed to the Warren Commission, and Allen Dulles, the former head of the CIA, who Kennedy fired, who basically was one of the masterminds behind the assassination, was put on the committee to determine who killed him. So he basically thwarted, ran the Warren Commission, and he saw to it that a lot of evidence did not come in. And then Hoover was in charge of the investigation because the Warren Commission didn't have an investigative body. So they deferred to the FBI and to the Dallas police. And those two entities did a horrible job because I don't think either of those entities wanted the truth to come out.
Correct. Yeah. I've gotten over the fact that these individuals were not, some may not have been properly trained, but they also had people who were leading them around by their nose as to what they could investigate, which I've actually seen actively happen in the Zodiac case, where an individual has got some information in regards to some of these cold cases, and they're being ordered to directly leave that case alone. And so I can see that if that's happening now, back in those days when everything was corrupt and they didn't want it found out, that if you even touched the case or came up on a lead, you were probably told not to even investigate it.
Yep. And the original CIA guy who had the task of investigating Oswald's connections with the CIA got frustrated because his own organization wasn't giving him the information he was requesting. So he resigned. He ended up resigning, and they put another guy in charge of that. I think it might have been Richard Helms at that point. Of course, when you appoint him, nobody's going to get anything from Richard Helms. So.
Well, and the fact that they even put Dulles in head of the Warren Commission, when Dulles specifically attempted to hide the MK Ultra project from the public by destroying a majority of the actual evidence and paperwork that was involved with that particular case. So I'm still aghast by the people who are in charge that are literally supposed to be the people we depend on to keep us safe, that is actually perpetuating these particular crimes, covering them up, and hoping that the America doesn't find out about them.
Yes. Well, for just a second, I want to plug one other book since we mentioned Dulles again. It's by the same author that wrote Brothers on the Kennedys. He wrote it after Brothers. It's called The Devil's Chessboard, and it's by David Talbot, and it's about the history of the CIA. And it talks about the Kennedy assassinations, both of them, but it talks about all kinds of assassinations all over the world. In Guatemala, in Chile, in Iran. So there's been government overthrows and assassinations for years and years and years under basically the leadership of the CIA.
Well, and that leads me into the character assassination, because the Zodiac killer did brag for most of his communications that he was smarter than law enforcement and the FBI, but not until 1990 did I see that he actually indicated he was even smarter than the CIA. So I'm trying to think of any organization that may have been higher than the CIA, or that Jack is literally calling out the CIA now to say, leave me alone because I have information on you too. The communications—
I think it's more the latter.
Right.
Yeah, I think he's kind of like the classic man who knew too much. And so the only thing they could do is basically kill him. And they do that to a lot of people. Yeah, David Morales, they killed him at the age of 53 because he knew way too much, because he's one of their assassins.
Correct.
His name came up last week.
In what?
When we were talking about the CIA, and we touched on the RFK assassination a little bit.
Right.
David Morales. And in the book Brothers, there's a good 8 to 10 pages devoted to David Atlee Phillips, another CIA guy, and David Morales.
Gotcha. Well, I know that in his 1990 letter, the Zodiac wrote to John Walsh. I was under the impression at first that he initially wrote this letter to John Walsh because John Walsh was actually running segments on the Zodiac case, and he wanted the truth to be told from his point of view. But when I read the communication, it really is it's not really about tell my story as much as it is he wants to communicate and pass information back and forth between himself and John Walsh, which is America's most wanted leader who is affiliated with the FBI. So that made me question, why did someone want John Walsh affected by the death of his son? Because we saw that his son was killed. And before he became John Walsh of America's Most Wanted, I'm not exactly sure what he did, but Harriet says she's solving some of these codes to indicate that there's some involvement with the Walsh family and the darker side of this earth that we're not very much aware of.
So you're saying that Jack Tarrance reached out to Walsh?
Yes. There's a series of letters.
I think a reason for that maybe too is just to share certain information that in case anything happened to Tarrance, that maybe that was someone he may have trusted to present the information, which would give him another layer of protection if the powers that be knew that there are third parties that had the same information that Jack had, then that may prevent them from killing Jack.
That would make sense, and that would mean that somebody on the John Walsh team would have to be able to understand the coding that was done in these messages that others are finding today. Yes. Well, and there was actually a coded cipher, an actual cipher that was sent to John Walsh, which I think that Harriet has a solve to it. I haven't discussed it with her yet, but it'll be interesting to find what she found in regards to that cipher.
Yes. And one entity we have not spoken about in the last week or this week is the NSA. And their whole purpose is solving puzzles and ciphers and things like that, decoding messages. And they're the biggest national security organization in the United States, way bigger than the CIA, way bigger than the FBI, the NSA. So
right, and the NSA
that some of these individuals have affiliations or contacts with people that work for the NSA.
Right. And I had spoke earlier about the Office of Strategic Services, that when they were finished after Roosevelt passed, that had broken off into CIA and NSA. So we saw the direct spinoff from that. And that's where I think that's possible Jack got his start. And that's why he believes he's smarter than everybody, including the CIA. Well, let's hop into our first murder as we're back. September 12th of 1964, we have two young boys, Alan 6 and Terry 11, from last name Westerfield, from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Now, this is a 20-year anniversary to the two little girls, Thames and Binnicker, that was killed in South Carolina. But we do see that these two boys go missing. They're not found. Some of the evidence behind this case is that they were dropped off by their stepfather, Carl Bach. He was a military police officer who dropped them off at the Broadway Theater downtown on Hay Street in Fayetteville, and which is consistent with the Grimes sister in 1956. They were supposedly at a theater as well themselves and went missing. Their mother, Margaret, went to the NCO club on Fort Bragg after arguing with her then husband Carl about relieving the babysitter Barbara Temple, where he admitted to dropping the boys off at a theater at approximately 4 p.m. for a double feature, and that he returned at dusk. They were nowhere to be found. Now, the children's biological father, interestingly enough, Tom Westerfield, was an Army sergeant stationed at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. Now, Margie actually met Carl Bach at Fort Bragg Post Exchange. And the reason why I thought this was important is because in the Texarkana Phantom murders, there's talk about the Red River Arsenal Post Exchange. In the Black Dahlia case, there's talk about a post exchange at I'm not going to remember the camp at this point, but it definitely was a military installation and a postal exchange in which she was familiar with. So, and of course, then the family lived on Madison in Bordeaux, which is right there outside of Fayetteville. Of course, we've still not had any bodies found, at least to my knowledge at this point. I did try to research and see if anything has come up with this case, but it hasn't. These children went missing to never be seen again. And that might be part of that perverted system that we were discussing. But that drops us right into the next murder, which is only within a couple weeks. Now, you got to keep in mind when there's something like 2 children going missing, all agencies get involved. So they had many jurisdictions right there within the North Carolina area that was involved, but also the FBI and other agencies have come in. They have a huge manhunt that is going on for these children at this point in time. And within a couple weeks of the abduction of these 2 children, we see the murder on October 12th of 1964 of Mary Pinchot Meyer in Washington, D.C., which is really about 4 hours from where these boys were abducted. My take on that sometimes is that this is, look over here, we've got this child case going on when we have something very important politically going on the other hand, and that is the murder of Meyer. Now, you know a little bit about this particular murder, correct?
Yeah, I learned most of it from the book Brothers, but I've also done a little outside research. Mary Meyer is one of the most enigmatic people that have ever lived. She lived a wonderful, great life. While she lived it, she was full of life. Everyone loved her. She got along with hippies. She got along with, well, her husband was in the CIA. Cord Meyer, I think he started in the OSS, went into the CIA, rose up highly through the ranks of the CIA to be like number 3 or 4 man in the CIA. His 2 best friends were Richard Helms and James Angleton.
Well, I also showed that he was the primary operative in Operation Mockingbird, a covert mission to sway public opinion using mass media. And that ties in this media connection to what I am saying is involved in these cases. I also like
has bought much of the media.
Right.
Yeah. So I could see, because he was a really smart person and he had a literature background in literature. So I could see him being the head of that.
Well, one of the other things that I noted on him is he was also a Scroll and Key member from Yale, which is also a partner sorority to the Skull and Bones. Right. That Bush actually attended himself. Yeah, the fraternities. I know that it also indicated she was a DC socialite and close friend of JFK. She was also a lover of JFK, and she actually targeted JFK during the Bay of Pigs fiasco while having this affair, affecting his decision making at that time, they say.
She was a confidant of JFK's, and we know that because James Angleton wiretapped her the place where she lived. She lived in a little cottage behind Ben Bradley. Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, married her sister. So,
gotcha.
And they had a cottage at their estate. And when we say cottage, we think a little grandma shack. No, it was a nice little house,
right,
on the same property. And she lived there. But James Angleton wiretapped that unit. He also wiretapped her studio in D.C., and he was listening to, so he knew about her affair with Kennedy, and he knew about everything about her. And he also knew that she had this diary that she kept that had lots of things in it that could potentially affect national security.
Correct. Well, I noticed that they also talked about her being that small circle of upper socialite women to influence the decision-making process of high political figures, men, by using sex and LSD, which is literally the MK Ultra project. That's exactly what they were designing that project to do, was the use of LSD and what information they could derive from an individual who was on it. She was actually shot to death on a walk. One in the head and the other in the heart. Definitely assassination, mob style tactics, right open on the street for everybody to see. It was an intentional homicide, and the assassination 2 weeks after the Warren Commission report was actually made public. Are they speaking then of the JFK Warren Commission report? Gotcha. Yes. So I also noted that at this point in time that the Zodiac is shortly going to use a letter that is watermarked with the F.W. Woolworth watermark, who happens to also be a member of the Scroll and Key fraternity. And this watermarked paper was purchased and sold in New York, New York. So the Zodiac is going to use some of this paper for some of his taunts. And I believe that there's a possibility that on this trip, this is where Jack obtained this particular paper. Now, Jack is actually living in Texas at the time. But the next murder that we're about to talk about actually occurs only 2 hours and 28 minutes from where he is, We've got about 5 minutes left here, Nolan.
Okay.
So I wanted to
let me make
mention
one more point on Mary Meyer. That's really important. Okay, Mary Meyer had a really good friend that knew about this diary and knew about the importance of it. So right after Mary Meyer's assassination, shall we say, she called her sister, Ben Bradley's wife, and said, hey, go into her place, her house, and find that diary and any other thing you think might be important, get it and destroy it. And so when they got there to the house, guess who was at the door trying to pick the lock?
Who?
James Angleton.
Oh,
And
wow.
then he kind of like squirreled away. They got into the house, they found the diary. So what do they do with the diary? They turn it over to Ellen Dulles.
Oh, geez.
Instead of destroying it, they give it to the CIA to destroy it. The CIA did not destroy it.
Of course not. Of course not.
So anyway,
well,
and Bradley, as editor of the Washington Post, did not pursue a strong investigation of the JFK murder. And everyone wonders why, since he and his wife were two of the best friends of Jackie Kennedy and John F. Kennedy.
Right. Another failed attempt to investigate anything. Well, what's also happening at this time in Jack's life is on December 22nd, 1964, his first wife, Letha, files for divorce papers citing extreme cruelty. Now, this may explain some of the Christmas murders we're going to start to see, because this could be a trigger for Jack. But Jack, at this point in time, has already ran off to Texas in 1963 before the JFK murders, with Doris Reynolds on his heels. And in February 5th of 1965, we see the interlocutory degree of divorce that actually occurs. However, we find out that that divorce decree is not finalized when Jack attempts to marry Doris for the first time. So we have a lot of happenings going on here in the next couple years. But I just wanted to show some of the relations. We can see down here in the number A, the Alcaloo, South Carolina, is where the Binnaker and Thames girls went missing, or were actually murdered and found. And then we see here in B is the Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is where the two Westerfield boys actually end up going missing and never found. And then literally just right up the road about 6 hours is where the murder of Mary Pinchot Meyer occurred. So again, we have relation to why I believe that this entire abduction of these children and the onset of all people who were involved that got involved with it, law enforcement and otherwise, these agencies were very busy trying to find these boys within those 2 weeks before this murder occurs with Meyer.
Okay.
And
was Jack living in that region at the time?
He was not, but it was supposed that, let's see, that was the end of 64, 65, that he was gone to some type of a hospital is the impression that I'm under. Now, the story's been told in a couple different ways. One is that Jack was in a hospital for some type of mental trauma due to his involvement with military and war. Another one was a supposition that he had attempted to sexually molest the daughter of Doris Reynolds. And she insisted that he goes into a alcohol program where he is purportedly off and away. I can hardly believe that this woman would marry Jack at a later date if he attempted at any point in time to molest her child. I mean, what woman does this? So I don't tend to believe this child molestation allegation, but it might have just been a good cover up for why Jack was away or why he was gone. Regardless of how that part of it went down, we know that he was not currently with Doris, so we don't currently know where he was at that point.
Well, we know he's highly mobile too. He can fly in and fly out in a moment's notice. So
in a heartbeat, that man seems to be able to get around in ways I cannot explain. We're down to about a minute at this point, and I thought we'd be a little bit farther. I do want to discuss the murders of Fred and Edwina Rogers, who are the parents of Charles Rogers, again, another CIA affiliate. The parents are found cut up and dismembered in the refrigerator. Their inner organs are found dropped in drainage dishes on the way out as you progressively move away from the property. This is going to be a little bit more intense because we have a lot of information on this individual and how he wraps around this particular series of crimes, but he ultimately goes missing. So I don't know, Nolan, if you want to join me next week for that one, but after that, I will definitely be hopping into the Cheri Jo Bates. Are you familiar with Cheri Jo Bates?
Yes, that's the Riverside murder that a lot of people think Tarrance or Zodiac committed.
Correct. We're correct. And I think there's a lot of information that suggests it is, even though today we're seeing a lot of people try to bifurcate these cases and act as though they're not one and the same, when clearly back in those days, not only did the handwriting match, but the MO matches and everything about that crime does suggest that it was the early beginnings of the Zodiac era, even though we know it's not the early beginnings of Jack's murders. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it here for now. Thank you so much for joining me, Nolan. Everybody have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you guys next week. Take care.
Bye.